Hi everybody, it's Marty Shoub here again to talk to you about Aliyah, about God's covenant faithfulness to the people of Israel. And last time we looked at the Torah, Leviticus 26, the blessings and the curses. And we looked at how even though there are conditional elements to the covenant God made with the people at Sinai, his faithfulness to the people endures forever. And just by way of review, I want to just highlight the verse that we really spent a lot of time on. That is Leviticus 26:44, because this is the verse that assures Israel that God will never utterly forsake them, never destroy them, because he is the Lord their God. So, Leviticus 26:44, yet in spite of this, or yet for all that, in spite of everything, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I so abhor them as to destroy them, breaking my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God, but I will remember for them the covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord. So, God promises, yet in spite of everything, yet for all that, I will not destroy them, because he is the Lord. He is the faithful God who cannot deny himself, as Paul tells us. And also, though, he says, for I am the Lord your God. Not only is he faithful, because that is who he is, but he has entered into covenant with Israel and taken them as his people. He says, I cannot break covenant with you because I am your God. We have entered into this relationship and I will never break covenant in spite of all that, yet for all that. And God says, I won't destroy them, but I will remember the covenant. But he doesn't really explain what that means. And so we're going to look in Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, we read an outline of what that restoration is all about. And it's so important for us to understand these passages. But before we get into the text, I just want to talk a little bit about the difference between Deuteronomy and Leviticus. First of all, the setting is quite different. Leviticus 26 is cast in terms of the whole book of Leviticus, a series of laws and expectations for Israel, particularly centered around Israel's worship at the tabernacle and what it means to be the people of God. Deuteronomy is after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, after all the trials and disappointments and difficulties Israel has experienced, they are now poised to enter the land. And they're camped on the east bank of the Jordan River, getting ready to go possess the land. But Moses knows he's not going in. The Lord has told him he will not enter the promised land. And so, in a sense, Deuteronomy is kind of like Moses' last chance to address the people. And so there's a sort of a sermon quality to it. It's very emphatic. And Moses is, in a sense, as you read the words, you get a sense that he's pleading with the people to remain faithful to the covenant. And when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 28, it outlines first, like Leviticus 26, blessings for obedience. And then starting, I think it's verse 15, it goes on with a series of curses. And it's quite extensive. It's quite detailed. Some of the features are different than what we read in Leviticus 26, but essentially it follows the same pattern. That is, first, disobedience is going to mean you're going to have difficulty. Instead of blessing, you'll have curses. But continued disobedience brings even greater difficulty, and eventually it means invasion, your cities being destroyed, and the people taken into captivity. And it's pretty grim. I just want to read a couple of verses from the end of Deuteronomy 28, because it's, as I said, it has a sermon quality to it, but it's very, very difficult. So let's read what it says here in Deuteronomy chapter 28. I'm going to read verses 64 and 68. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you and your fathers have not known. And the Lord will bring you back to Egypt in ships, by the way about which I spoke to you. You will never see it again. And there you will be made to offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but there will be no buyer. The final outcome of this exile, as we read it in Deuteronomy 28, is Israel returning back to Egypt, the very place that God delivered them from. And they're in such a desperate state that they're willing to offer themselves as slaves. But they are so destitute that no one will buy them. I mean, this is about as low as one can get without being utterly destroyed. It's a very, very bleak and bitter picture that we read at the end of Deuteronomy 28. But it's a little different also because, unlike Leviticus 26, it doesn't then go on to say, but if you recognize that you have sinned against me and you turn back to me, I will return back to you. Like we read in Leviticus chapter 26, starting in verse 40. There's no promise of restoration. It just ends with Israel back where they started, destitute and forlorn in Egypt. We have again in Deuteronomy 29, instead of going on to the restoration passages, Moses recounts Israel's history, their deliverance from Egypt, and all the difficulties they faced in the wilderness for the last 40 years. It's almost as if Moses is saying, look, I want you to really take hold of this. I mean, he starts the book of Deuteronomy explaining all the wonders God has done to deliver them from Egypt and all the difficulties they faced in the wilderness, how when they sent out the spies, they refused not to go into the land, and so on, and all the difficulties they'd experienced, all the trials and so on. And here again, Moses is taking the time to review Israel's history. It's almost as if I think he's wanting the people to really take stock. Look at what God has done for you, and look at what has happened when you have failed to trust the Lord, when you have failed to obey the Lord, then things have gone really bad. And so before he talks about restoration, he wants the people to remember what things have been like for them, the good things that God has done, and the terrible consequences for their disobedience and for their lack of trust. One of the things he says in chapter 29, I think is pretty important. He says this. I'm reading in verse 4. Yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. I've led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn out on your foot. I guess what he's saying is like, I don't get it. For 40 years, you've seen God's miraculous provision. You've been fed with manna every day. You've seen the pillar of smoke by day, the pillar of fire by night, all the miracles God's done. Your sandals haven't worn out. Everything God promised us, he has done. And yet, for some reason, and it's almost as if he can't quite put his finger on it, the Lord hasn't given you eyes to see, or ears to hear, or a heart to understand. And actually, Paul picks up on this in Romans chapter 11, verse 8. I just wanted to bring that out because this whole issue of Israel's eyes to see and ears to hear is so central to Aliyah, and especially the role of God's people in the nations to facilitate the return of the Jewish people. So Moses is kind of complaining that it's been 40 years and still they don't get it. I just want to maybe have you consider how long it has been, and still Israel does not have eyes to see nor ears to hear. And so much of that is dependent on what you and I do to assist in Israel's restoration. We have a role to play. And even here, in the blessings and the curses and this pause of reflection in between them, we have just an intimation about the matter of Israel really grasping who they are and being able to see. We go on to the first 10 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 30. So let's look at these verses. It sounds very much like the beginning of the restoration passage in Leviticus 26. So it shall be, when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I've set before you, and you call them to mind, or literally in the Hebrew, take them to heart, in all the nations where the Lord your God has banished you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity. A lot of modern translations have the Lord will restore your fortunes. The Lord will restore you from captivity and have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the ends of the earth, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will prosper you, and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. And the Lord your God will inflict all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the Lord and observe all his commandments which I command you today. And then the Lord your God will prosper you abundantly all the work of your hand, in the offspring of your body, and in the offspring of your cattle, and in the produce of your ground. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, just as he rejoiced over your fathers, if you obey the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes which are written in this book of the law, if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So in Leviticus 26, the Lord promises, nevertheless, in spite of everything, I will remember the covenant. But here in Deuteronomy 30, though it starts the same way with Israel responding to God in repentance, acknowledging their sin, turning back to the Lord, here, as it says in Deuteronomy 30, with all their heart and with all their soul, then the Lord says, I will restore your captivity, or as many translations phrase it, I will restore your fortunes. And then it begins to outline what that is. What is Israel's restoration? Well, there's really 5 dimensions to Israel's restoration as we read it here in Deuteronomy 30. 1, I will gather you from exile. And we understand, of course, that Israel's restoration is about Israel returning back to the land. But that's just one aspect. I will gather you from exile. I'll bless you with prosperity. I will expand your population. I will punish your persecutors. And I think this is the most important of all the elements of Aliyah. Even more important, I would say, than returning back to the land is this: I will transform you. I will change your heart. As it is put in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. You know, I like to say that the heart is the heart of the matter, and I'd like you to consider this. The ultimate goal of Aliyah is not just Israel regathered in the land. Because if Israel is regathered, but God doesn't transform Israel's heart, then what's going to happen? Israel will yet again disobey the Lord, and yet again come under the curses of the covenant and be exiled. And actually, that's what happened in history. When Israel came back after 70 years, after the Babylonian captivity, we don't read about a spiritual transformation of the nation. In fact, if you read in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah, if you read in the prophets Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, these are writers from the days of the returning from exile, Israel is continuing to have difficulties. Israel is continuing to fall short. Israel is continuing to be disobedient. And within 40 years of Yeshua's death and resurrection, what happened? Just like the Babylonians, the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and just like what happened in that first exile, Israel ended up scattered out of the land of promise, not only to Babylon, but to the ends of the earth, just as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 64. So, the heart is the heart of the matter. In Deuteronomy 29, Moses is complaining, for some reason, the Lord has not given you eyes to see and ears to hear and a heart to understand. But the promise of restoration is, I will circumcise your heart that you will love me with all your heart and all your soul, and you will live. You will have eyes to see. You will have ears to hear, and your heart will understand. Now, my brothers and sisters, we're talking about the new covenant, which is all about the transformation of the heart. And you can look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, as the new covenant embedded in the Torah. And really, when you look at the prophetic writings, and especially all the restoration passages and what God promises, and all this wonderful, beautiful passages in Isaiah and in Jeremiah, all the prophets, it's really based on this formula of restoration outlined here in Deuteronomy chapter 30. But a special importance is this transformation of the heart. Because what is the new covenant? How does Jeremiah describe the new covenant? This is the covenant which I'll make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. The new covenant is God writing the Torah on the human heart. It's really another way of saying, and I will circumcise your heart so that you will love me with all your heart and soul and live. And of course, the other very, very well-known passage that talks about spiritual transformation, found in Ezekiel chapter 36. What does it say? I'm reading from verse 26. Moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be careful to observe my ordinances. You will live in the land that I gave to your forefathers, so that you will be my people, and I will be your God. Ultimately, Aliyah is the fulfillment of the promise God made to Israel all the way back in Exodus chapter 6. And I will take you unto myself, and you will be my people, and I will be your God, because I will transform you from the inside out. I will write my Torah in your heart. I will give you a new, soft, tender heart of flesh and fill you with my Holy Spirit. The heart is the heart of the matter. And the thing is, as we read about these wonderful restoration promises found in the Torah, you cannot divide spiritual transformation from Israel's restoration back to the land. They're just two sides of one coin. So, of course, spiritual transformation is the most important thing. But in God's plan and in his purposes and in his order that he has determined, for he is the Lord, Israel is to be regathered into the land, and then, as Ezekiel says, I will pour clean water on you and cleanse you from your sin. And then I will give you a new heart and put my spirit within you. Aliyah is to go up. Aliyah is spiritual transformation. Aliyah is regathering Israel from the very furthest ends of the earth back to the land God promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And it's all part of God's wonderful plan to transform Israel, to redeem Israel, to restore Israel, and bring salvation to the ends of the earth. These are not separate matters. These are interconnected purposes. And there is a reciprocation of blessing between Israel's restoration and blessings for God's people in the nations. We're going to look at that one next time. God bless you, and thank you once again for standing on the walls of Jerusalem, interceding on behalf of the people of Israel for their restoration as you continue on your watch on the altar of prayer. And I would ask you to especially pray through the words of Deuteronomy chapter 31 to 10, especially verse 6, that God would circumcise Israel's heart to love him with all their heart and soul and live. God bless you, and we'll talk again.